I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this panel session today on the new drivers of development and progress towards the Millennium Development Goals. And really, that is the issue for today. And we have a very distinguished panel here to the left of me to discuss this topic. So let me first introduce the panel to you, strictly in alphabetical order. Gordon Brown, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Bill Gates, Chairman of Microsoft. Trevor Manuel, Finance Minister of South Africa. Michael Treschow, Chairman of Unilever. And Bob Zoellick, President of World Bank. Welcome, all of you. You know, it's interesting, over the past few days in Davos, I've been wandering around the halls of Davos and looking at the badges of people, greeting a lot of people here, and it was apparent to me that the bulk of people in Davos have come from the richer countries of the world. Not all of them, but the bulk of the people in Davos. Everybody has a badge they proudly display, which talks about their corporate or organizational affiliation. In the middle of this time in Davos, I was also calling my daughter at home and trying to be a mother. And while I was doing that, I sat back and I thought about that mother in Mali, in Africa. This mother in Mali setting out on a daily trek to find some water and some food. Her children have no school to go to. The crop has failed again. There's not enough food. There is no help from government. Money is short. And the idea of work that isn't working in the hot sun with very few rewards to show seems like a distant dream. And you know what? The mother returns home after that trek in the hot sun without much food and perhaps not enough water for the family. Since sitting back and thinking to myself, what does this mother know about Davos? What does that mother in Mali know about MDGs? Probably nothing. But she knows something very immediate. She has not enough food, not enough water. The one thing she's hoping is there's somebody there in the richer countries that are thinking about helping her. But there's one thing we do know. We know that we have the answers and the means to help that mother in Mali. You know, it's interesting, all of our discussions here in Davos can be stripped of emotion. We talk about drivers of development, Millennium Development Goals, they all sound wonderful. But we should not forget that there's a human being behind each of these goals and each of these initiatives. I know it's not you or me looking for water, but we could be. So as we have the discussion on this panel, I want us to do it in a spirit of can-do optimism and a must-do responsibility. The reason the can-do optimism is important is because we can make sure that mother gets food, we can make sure those children go to school, we can make sure that there's enough water for those villages in Africa. Our session today is designed to be a conversation, and I'd like to encourage all of us to talk to each other. I've been told that a good moderator opens and closes and says nothing in between. And I'm going to try to follow that rule. And I want us to focus the discussion today on two things, Africa and partnerships. Why am I narrowing the discussion? If we talk about Millennium Development Goals and drivers of development in 1 hour, we will be a millimeter wide and not deep at all. So I want us to focus on Africa and partnerships. Africa because it's still the continent most blighted by war. There's poor governance in many countries, a lot of poverty. More than 40% of Africans still live on less than $1 a day. 1 in 6 don't reach their 5th birthday. If we can address issues in Africa, we will have met the Millennium Development Goals. And partnership because solutions in Africa cannot come by any one organization working alone. We have to work in partnership. A last point before we begin to the panelists. You know, when I was growing up in Madras as a child, my siblings and I would sit around the kitchen table with my mother and we'd have fierce discussions. And if we talked too much, she would cut us off. Now, I don't intend to be fierce with you, but I just want you to remember one thing. This is my kitchen table. So, with that, let me begin by saying that there are many dimensions to development, and each of these panelists here have a very unique contribution to make in this whole conversation. So, for the sake of getting the discussion started, let me turn to you, Bill Gates. This morning you announced a major agriculture initiative in partnership with the World Bank and many other organizations. Perhaps you could tell us what you hope to accomplish, and also say a little bit about what you hope to get from other partners to realize your goals in this agriculture initiative.
Yeah, I think whenever we want to drive development, we have to always look at why it hasn't been driven in the past. Why, with the great prosperity of the richest 2 billion, that hasn't happened for the poorest 2 billion, which is particularly in Africa. And I think the answer is that we haven't had enough visibility of the conditions, and we haven't had enough sense that applying resources the right way really can make a difference. And I do think there's evidence over these last 5 years that if we stick to this, if we raise the visibility, if we look at the success stories, if we set up the metrics and tune the work to make sure we're achieving those, that we can draw more people in. Two of the key areas are health and agriculture. And as you said, the Foundation made some new announcements today, about $300 million, the bulk of which is for agriculture in Africa, soil health, dairy production, coffee production, and really trying to tap into rich world markets where you can export the milk, export the coffee, and have soils that are good enough to not only sustain the people but provide cash crops. There are many partnerships embedded in these things. People like TechnoServe that have been out in Africa realizing how hard things are, or CARE, or Heifer, who's been an expert on livestock and what can be done there. And I'd emphasize the importance of agriculture. 64% of these very poor people are rural, and you're just not going to get development going without improvements there, and yet the amount of aid into the agricultural area has dropped down to be only about 4%. I think agriculture is lagging a little bit behind health. I mean, health is still very important, but there we had partnerships like the Global Alliance for Vaccines or the Global Fund that we laid those out, made big measurable promises, were able to achieve most of those promises, and people could say, yes, vaccines are pretty magical, or giving AIDS drugs really does save lives. Now, with agriculture, there's more pieces to put together. It's not just magic seeds, or not just fertilizer, or not just market access. All those things have to line up, which is very tricky, particularly if the weather conditions, because of just the natural conditions in Africa or climate change on top of that, make it more difficult. So it still takes some optimism, but we're publishing some numeric goals for what we're going to try and do with these agricultural grants, and use that so everybody learns from what's going on there.
Thank you, Bill. You know, there's a great Scottish saying, you might be very proud of me, Prime Minister Brown, for using a Scottish saying here, but there's a great one which says, you make every penny a prisoner. Okay? If you use that logic here in Africa, all the monies that are going to Africa, you've got to stretch that dollar a lot more, which brings us to the notion of governance of the countries in Africa. It's money's pouring in. I mean, you've just committed $300 million. Other organizations are committing money. But if we don't have good governance in Africa, the money is not wisely spent, and every penny is not a prisoner. So let me turn to you, Trevor. You are part of the new Partnership for African Development, and you've played a major role in mobilizing African political leadership for the Millennium Development Goals. What role do you think you can play in improving the governance in the different countries in Africa?
Thank you very much, Indra. Just before dealing with the question, there's probably somebody here who's far more qualified than I to talk on this. It's Donald Kaberuka. He's presently the president of the African Development Bank, but Donald was finance minister in Rwanda through its most difficult period, from the point of genocide to the building of a strong economy that has all of the manifestations of the best governance, toughest decisions, and I think there are many people across the continent like Donald, and that I think is very much a source of our strength. But if you want governance, then you need people. If you want people, then you need to be able to retain skill. Now, frequently when skills are sourced from Africa, we're told that we should be thankful that there are flowbacks through remittances. But the opportunity costs of too many skills leaving the continent is an enormous difficulty for us. Gordon and I served together on the Commission for Africa 3 years ago now, and in its findings, there was a very strong recommendation that we should put together a fund of something in the order of $500 million a year to invest in tertiary institutions on the African continent, many of which have become very badly run down because the elite can afford to send their children to Ivy League universities or European universities. And if you aren't investing in people, then you don't have the necessary skills for governance. Similarly, I think that there's a second proposal in the Commission for Africa, $3 billion over 10 years, to build centers of excellence in science and technology, because part of the story of agriculture as well is knowing that we can have appropriate technologies, appropriate to the climatic conditions of Africa, appropriate to the vast untapped organic resources of Africa, and appropriate to the times in the world. So it's small investments in people that will make a durable difference to development in the world, and certainly in the quality of life of African people.
Clearly, the Western world has got skills in abundance. So let me turn to you, Prime Minister Brown, and say, what do you think the Western governments can do to help African governments really get up that first rung on the ladder of development?
I think we've got to back success. I mean, if you were to ask me what's changed since a year ago or 2 years ago, or what's fast changing, first of all, Trevor's right. There are good governments that are achieving high rates of growth. Rwanda was mentioned, Uganda, Tanzania, things are moving forward, 5% growth a year, so there is success. And there is transparency in a number of countries at a far higher level than ever before. I mean, I've got to confess that the first conference I ever went to as a finance minister in Africa, I spoke to a resolution opposing bribery and corruption, arrived at the airport and could only leave the airport if I paid a bribe. And it brought home to me that things had to be done. And I think a lot has been done. And I praise those governments that have made the difference. I think the second thing that is really interesting is that women are changing Africa. And if you look around Africa, and I know, Trevor, you're a great successful finance minister, but I think you would agree with me that some great women are making huge changes. And when I'm in Africa in different countries,
and then the World Bank steals them.
Then the World Bank steals them. I see women, Liberia and Mozambique, changing Africa, and at a local level, I think that's making a huge difference. I think the third thing, and this is where we can help, is backing the successful initiatives. And in education, I think progress is being made, and we can make a huge push forward in the next year or two. I was in Tanzania and Uganda a few weeks ago. I had been in Kenya before. And you know, when Kenya made education free for children, 1 million children turned up that week just to be registered for school. And Uganda's trebled its numbers in education by making it free. We helped to provide the money. Education opportunity becomes available. 20 million children have got into school. And then you go to Nigeria, as I did, and I was in Abuja, and I went to a school in Abuja which was absolutely run down, 150 kids to a classroom. And then I heard, very nearby, a madrasa had been started by an Al-Qaeda-related organization, offering free education, but in return for indoctrination. And this is the challenge for us. If we don't provide education and make it possible for people to get opportunity, there are groups who are prepared to exploit people's grievances, and there is a terrorist problem in the making in some parts of Africa, as well as it is in other parts of the world. So my lessons from the last year or two, from since I was here last, is increase the partnerships, back success. Education is absolutely critical, and we could actually achieve our Millennium Development Goals if we worked hard, and I hope the private sector and the charitable sector will be involved as well. Back the women leaders that are developing, and back those governments that are operating in a transparent and open way, and you start to change the view that people have had traditionally of Africa, and you start to make people believe that the money we put in can make a huge difference.
But if I may ask a follow-up question, Prime Minister, we talked about a skills gap to address the issues of today. So if the money flows into Africa, there's still shortage of skills to really administer the programs, embed them in the countries. The programs you talked about are a bit long-term. Education will help over the next 15 or 20 years. But going back to the point that Trevor made, are we actually working on a skills building fund for the short term to actually take the people that are there today, the leaders, but don't know how to run the country in a Western style, and actually bring them into the Western style way of management?
Yes, we are. But remember also that we are signing with African governments, education plans for primary and secondary education as well. And we've signed agreements with 21 countries, lots of other countries in the world ready to back these plans, the World Bank's Fast Track Initiative part of it. So we're not at the stage of the odd primary school being built or the odd group of teachers being hired or trained. This is a systematic attempt to provide millions of people with education, teacher training, the building of schools throughout Africa. And the ambitions of the kids, I mean, in that classroom in Nigeria, they all wanted to be engineers and doctors and nurses, and nobody wanted to be a politician, by the way, but they all wanted to be, in careers, and therefore provide opportunity. And I think we can see things moving pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. Let me come to you, Bob, for just a second and talk about the role of the World Bank. You made a speech this week and you talked about the fight against hunger and malnutrition has to be a global priority, especially in the context of higher food prices, and you referred to the situation in sub-Saharan Africa in particular. You also said that hunger and malnutrition were problems that required a broader set of initiatives. Could you expand on what you meant by that and how you see the World Bank's distinctive role, especially in Africa?
Well, first, I'm going to try to find out for all of you when the session is over how the Prime Minister got out of that country, and I'll try to report it to you later. Well, let's go back to your woman in Mali that you mentioned. Mm-hmm. The reason I tried to highlight the hunger and malnutrition issue is that in some ways it's been the forgotten Millennium Development Goal. It's not been the source of a fund or attention, although the increase in food prices, a very good article in Lancet, and a couple of other things are now putting it on the screen. And this is, in my view, a double tragedy because in some ways it's the multiplier goal. If you look at the greatest source of risk for child mortality, it's malnutrition. 3 to 5 million children die a year because of malnutrition. If you look at the mother that you mentioned and you talk about maternal health, 20% of the women's deaths from birth are because of malnutrition. If you talk about education, if kids don't get nourishment to start, they're going to be handicapped and some of them are going to be held back their whole life. So some people look at hunger and malnutrition as an effect of poverty, but it also becomes a cause of poverty. And this is one reason we've joined this partnership with the Gates Foundation on the agriculture side, because what our research also showed was that the overall gains to overcoming poverty from growth in the agricultural sector are 3 times that in other sectors. Now, as Bill mentioned, it's part because of the rural areas, so you can sort of see the benefits of it. But when you look at the resources people are devoting, HIV/AIDS, very important, but about $2.2 billion a year. In this area, for malnutrition, other than food aid, about $250 million a year, even though its effect could be great. And the sad point is we really know what to do. This one doesn't need a big breakthrough. You could use micronutrients for that mother in Mali. We can talk about longer breastfeeding, makes a huge difference. And to relate it to the hunger and high price issue, we can do things in terms of school feeding programs that get kids in school, get them the nutrition. You can do things where you provide some cash transfers or food if people help build the irrigation systems to make these work. So you can get the connectivity in the programs at the same time you're addressing this issue. So frankly, I hope one of the things that comes out of Davos this year is not just talking about stock and financial markets in developed countries, but this issue for developing countries.
But let me have a follow-up with you, Bob. A couple of years ago, the bank evaluation report came back on the World Bank's efforts in Africa, and it wasn't a very positive report on the way you're following up on the investments that you're making. I know that was not under your watch, but now you've inherited the problem. Question is, what are you going to do differently in terms of holding yourselves accountable for progress in Africa so that the money is being spent wisely and progress is actually being made?
Well, it goes back to some of the things that Bill mentioned. We both talked about a green revolution in Africa, but we've tried to distinguish it from the image that was set in South Asia, where it was focused primarily on particular seeds, and there were some issues about water and fertilizers. And what we're really trying to emphasize is the whole value-added chain. Frankly, it starts with property rights and land tenure. It requires some sense of fertilizer, some irrigation, seeds, and by the way, seed development could be very important, particularly if you're going to have changes in climate where you're going to have to deal with drought and other conditions. but it's also basic market conditions. Some of the challenges we're talking with the World Food Program that they're dealing with in countries today is the fact that even within a country, you might have hunger in one part, but not the markets to be able to transfer the food. So they're shifting to a logic of food assistance. So they may use cash transfers to buy local food. So I think that the point is that we know what you can do to increase productivity in agriculture, and we know the tremendous gains. We have to get the connection right, and this goes back to a point that you were talking about with the Prime Minister. At the end of the day, it has to be national ownership. None of us can do it alone. We can't do it from the outside. I guess where I would take a slight difference with one of your points is that, frankly, I think a big difference that I now have seen in Africa with 20, 25 years ago, it's a lot of talented people. There's a lot of people running those countries, running those ministries that know what they want to do. And by the way, they don't only want to be seen as sort of wards of an international system. They want to grow. So it goes to energy and infrastructure and regional integration and other things. So there's an opportunity here, but ultimately it's got to be built on national ownership with us helping.
Thank you. Let me come to you, Michael. I mean, corporations, which you and I are part of, we run large, successful enterprises. We'd like to consider ourselves models of efficiency. And you've played a central role in the Business Alliance Against Chronic Hunger. And lots of multinational companies and local companies do have great presence in countries like Africa. What would you say to business leaders to take on a role similar to what Unilever took on to make a difference in programs such as yours?
Well, we in Unilever normally say you can do good by doing well. And what does that mean? It means really that for Unilever we can both do business, which means selling products and manufacture, but at the same time using our competences, our resources, our people on the ground, our footprint to do good. And that's really, we can do both things. And there is no conflict, it actually strengthens each other. And we have done two rather interesting studies that has been done with outside people, one by Oxfam in Indonesia and one by Professor Epstein in INSEAD, to figure out the consequences of Unilever being in those countries. And there are a number of observations you can do, but I mean, one interesting observation in Indonesia was that 86% of the wealth that we create doing business in Indonesia stays in Indonesia, which means everybody believes that we pull everything out and take it home and give it to shareholders. That's not the case. The other thing is we employ directly 5,000 people in Indonesia, but 300,000 people are in our sort of employment network. So there are a number of those facts and figures, and particularly also it helps us to understand where should we focus on and together with whom in order to do good. And I mean, we are in food products, we are in nutrition, so it's very obvious to provide food to children and nutrition to children. We do that together with the World Food Program and UNICEF, for instance. We do cleaning, we teach children how to use soap to clean their hands. I mean, an obvious thing that we believe is very important and essential. And then when it comes to this business alliances for chronic hunger, where there are 30 companies, it was started here, actually in Davos with the forum. We do that in a little district in western Kenya, where it's actually focused on helping farmers. And it's about 15,000 farmers, and together with their families, it's 75,000 people, to try to actually move up the ladder when it comes to better crops. And we will use our agri people from our tea plantations to help them to get better yield from their plantations and what they do, and help them also in entrepreneurship in the retail end of it. So there are many, many initiatives that we do not the least in Africa, in South Africa and in Kenya and Ghana and some others, in order to actually use our competence. So I mean, and for the people working in Unilever, I mean, this is a great feeling. You can imagine that everyone, now it's not only fundraising, but everybody wants to participate.
So let me throw a last question to the panel before turning to the floor to get your questions. And Bill, your initiative which you just announced, you heard Michael just talk about what Unilever can do and has models of success. We ourselves signed up with Jeff Sachs and the Earth Institute to do a major agricultural project in Mali to figure out how to get sustainable agricultural practices into Mali. So many companies are doing so many things. Who's going to coordinate everything we do so that there's some logic and some sequencing of all our activities so that taken together we can see some meaningful progress in the real difficult parts of Africa as opposed to a series of rifle-shot efforts?
Well, many of these things don't need to be coordinated, thank goodness. You know, the rich world economy is truly a miracle in lack of coordination, and it works extremely well. There are elements where you take, say, agriculture, where you do want to get the things working together. You can actually have things that hurt. If a government comes in and says they're going to offer cheap fertilizer, then people don't buy market price fertilizer, but then if it doesn't show up, you've lost a whole year of crops, which is disastrous given the lack of savings and resiliency in these systems. So you do need partnerships. You know, I think Unilever is a good example of a variety of activities because you have some things like your soap initiatives that are great, that are really sort of fortune at the bottom of the pyramid type initiatives, and then you have some micronutrient things that probably you know, aren't going to have some big payback, and yet the beneficial effect and I think the positive recognition of that great work, things can come out of that. So the people involved in agriculture do need to work together. We do need to get the buyers to come in and be willing to take more products out of Africa. We need to get the different inputs coming together. And so within a particular area, we have coordination. In health, I'm pretty impressed with the coordination that, you know, people are thinking about that primary health care center, what expertise needs to be done there. And there's been a lot of talk about avoiding purely vertical approaches and, you know, some good progress with how global fund money is used more horizontally to get a holistic look at health activities.
But is there some sort of a knowledge management system which captures everybody's best practices so that others can learn from them?
Yeah, I think that too can be somewhat sector-based. For example, in health, there's a group that Chris Murray is the head of called Health Metrics Network, and he will be ruthlessly independent about, you know, going out and looking at how well things are done. I think there's an overall theme here of measurement that is so much stronger than ever before, and that's what it allows us to create a positive feedback cycle that people are willing to get involved and do more things. These agricultural grants we're giving, you know, it's very clear. It's about increasing the income level of these smallholders. And so you can go back for the large group in 5 years and for the pilot group in 2 years and really look and say, did those incomes improve or not? We'll publish what our target is. We'll publish what we see as a result there and talk about where things fell short. So I do think that having expertise in analysis and some of the tools now let us do those things, give people a confidence to move forward and correct the things that aren't particularly effective.
Thank you, Bill. Let me toss the questions now to the audience. And if anybody has any questions to throw to the panel, please do so now. Mike? If you could just keep your question short, and if you have a statement, just phrase it as a question, please.
Okay, here's my question. I'm Gary Cohen with Becton Dickinson, also a board director of the U.S. Fund for UNICEF and CDC Foundation. And it involves an area that's not often talked about, but is directly related, in my opinion, and that's the effect of child exploitation on disease spread and undermining the development of economies. And in real brief, if you look at the statistics associated with sexually exploited children, not only children who are trafficked, but sexually exploited in general, their rates of HIV prevalence and growth, and abandoned children, you can talk about that perhaps in Southern Africa because of the HIV prevalence rates, And then in the CIS region, extraordinarily high prevalence among children who are abandoned, sometimes 50 times higher, 60 times higher than the general population. They become vectors for further disease spread. And I also want to pay a compliment to South Africa, which very recently significantly strengthened its laws regarding sexual exploitation of children. But this is something that happens, by the way, throughout the world, with particularly bad implications in countries that have high disease prevalence, particularly HIV/AIDS. What can we do in terms of law strengthening and over the longer term changes in societal norms? This is also a key issue in empowerment of young women.
Trevor, you want to take this question and talk about the experience in South Africa, perhaps?
You know, legislation is only a small part of it, Indra. The key issue with every aspect of development is how we strengthen communities. Now, I think one of the issues that we all need to apply our minds to is that countries become far more atomized. I mean, wealth becomes a predeterminant for everything. And so better performers leave poor communities. And poor communities then have more people at risk. And the more vulnerable, like children and the aged, are therefore more at risk. And one of the big initiatives, I believe, that we must put back into development, it's not a fashionable thing, but a very necessary part of it, is reconstructing community norms, because over many, many generations, communities have held themselves together, but those bonds break. And I don't think it's a uniquely African experience. I think many, many developing countries experience the same problems. But it's not spoken of in development. It's not something that features in discussions in financial markets. But I think it's a sine qua non for the success of development and the protection of those most vulnerable in all societies.
Thank you. Other questions? Please.
Arthur Butambara from Zimbabwe. What efforts are being carried out to move Africans and African countries up the value chain and up the skills chain so that we can move from a commodity-based economy to value addition, manufacturing, to exporting capital, to exporting knowledge? What are we doing to make sure minerals are processed in Africa, diamonds are cut and processed in South Africa and not in Israel? What are we doing to move Africans up the value chain and the skills chain?
Bob, you want to take that?
Well, I'll start. Trevor certainly may want to comment on this too, because it allows me to draw in one more point that is relevant to the food issue too, and that is, to make markets work, we not only need to make them work in countries and in regions, but we need to make them work globally. So I know that Pascal Lamy is going to be trying to put a big push on to try to close the Doha agenda. And frankly, a key aspect of this about being able to move up the value chain is being able to sell your goods and your products. There are some programs. The U.S. has the AGOA program. The Europe has the Everything But Arms that try to offer this opportunity to start. But then I think it also comes back to working with the countries to build in some of the things the Prime Minister was talking about skills and vocational level. I was talking about this with Trevor in South Africa about trying to get good vocational training to help people to be able to work on higher value-added jobs. Then it's also a question of being able to draw the capital and investment. So it's like these other pieces that we've talked about. It's how they're integrated as a whole. And ultimately, just to add on the point that Trevor mentioned, it's a combination of what the signals that communities and governments send. And the government's also creating the environment, as a business person, where you know, to make this have a chance to grow. Because you're still ultimately competing globally.
Prime Minister Brown, do you want to add anything?
I was going to add about agriculture. Bill's absolutely right that these local initiatives that are making a difference have got to be supported, and the idea that there's some top-down government or international sort of pressure on them to do certain things would be wrong. On the other hand, on agriculture, we've got to recognize that 70% of the world are still in agriculture, that it's right that for every pound we spend on agriculture, it's 4 times more efficient in getting people out of poverty than spent on other sectors. And we really have to get this trade deal signed so that instead of the richest countries subsidizing their own agricultures at the expense of the poorer countries, there is access for the poorer countries to the markets of the richest countries. And Africa is effectively discriminated against by the subsidies that we in Europe and America are giving to our own producers at $1 billion a day. The other point about the value-added chain that's been made by our questioner from Zimbabwe, I think I'm right in saying that companies like Anglo-American have moved from 25% local supply to about 60% local supply. So there is a recognition among some of these big companies that the more that they can allow the chain of production to be in the countries where they're doing extraction, the better it is for the local population. And I think the extraction industry's initiative, the transparency that's required of extracting companies and now required of construction companies and now to be required of other companies is going to make a big difference. And I think we should be thinking long term, expanding the supply chains in Africa, using the distribution networks that have been set up by companies like your own Indra, and making that the basis of other industries and other services coming off them, using the fact that mobile telecommunications is going to be the way forward in Africa to do financial services and other services coming off that. And you can leapfrog some of the development stages that Europe or America had to undergo by using the new technology, and particularly computer technology, to better effect. So you can move up the value-added chain quicker, but obviously it needs a trade deal that is conducive to Africa benefiting from its own produce. And I think that is a priority over the next few weeks.
Staying with the moving up the value chain, Trevor, perhaps you can talk about how South Africa has moved up the value chain or not in the diamond business.
Well, you know, one of the good things about living in southern Africa is that our neighbors in Botswana have just opened a huge cutting and polishing plant. They are a few years ahead of us, but it's very encouraging to see that in place now. But I want to come back to one of the points I'd raised earlier, and that was the commitment to science and technology on the continent. So it's not just copying and emulating, it's working off a base that we can understand. Former Finance Minister of Nigeria, Ngozi, who is around somewhere in Davos, was actually one of the key drivers of this. It's there, the plan is on the table, it needs to be financed and taken forward. But the other issue is food, and food, I think, in part it's a hunger issue, but in part it's a production issue. Now, on the hunger side, I think we need to understand how decisions come together. The market access and tariff accelerations is one part of the problem. The other part of it is what we're seeing with grain crops at the moment. I mean, a third of US corn crops is going into bioethanol. The prices are exceedingly high. There's been a knock-on effect across other grains, wheat and rice, and these are staples for the poor around the world, and so access, nutrition become big issues. We've got to evaluate that in the context as well. And then, you see, there's so much pristine land. What wealthy people around the world want is organic food. Now, Africa can deliver if we can get a bit of priming of the pump by getting better infrastructure, including irrigation, in place to get good food to people, if their governments will let us access the markets. So these issues act together, and so we can move up the value chain, but it doesn't mean that we try and emulate other countries. We can, in fact, take very African initiatives on these things too.
Michael, any examples from Unilever on how you've moved up the value chain in certain countries?
I think it becomes the obvious thing, that is help to self-help. And whether it is to help children learn how to wash their hands, or it is to help the farmers to grow better crop, or where we have initiatives where farmers make herbs that we then give them a fixed price on to make sure that they can continue to doing that, and also how you train them through, and if I put on my Ericsson hat, to say on the mobile communication that they actually are less dependent on the middleman that will tell them exactly on the prices on the crop or whatever, which means that they can figure out themselves what it is. So there are many of those initiatives, but everything comes under one word, and that's education. And I think education will be the prime driver to actually move up the value chain.
Thank you. Yes?
I I'm Deb Insel with Reach for College. We're based in Washington, D.C., and just in my very small, tiny part of the world, we found great value in getting together all the college access nonprofits to sort of see how we were overlapping or ways that we could fill in gaps in things that were needed. And I want to go back to your question because it seemed like a good one. It seems like there are a lot of people, nonprofits, NGOs, corporations, governments who are working in Africa. And I just wonder if there is any sort of database per sector, per country to coordinate all these efforts.
Bill, this is one for you and for the Prime Minister, because I think it's crying for a Microsoft-based solution of a knowledge management system that all of us can access. And so let me toss it back to you again and see if you bite this time.
Well, certainly there's a lot that can be done in terms of getting information online so that you can find the people acting in different ways. You know, and some of this is visibility all the way to an individual donor who can see somebody that they might want to loan money to or give a grant to that it's not there yet, and there's some difficulties with it, but ending up putting that together. There's a lot of paperwork still done for the various UN groups and NGOs and rich world governments that is quite redundant. So there definitely is room for an initiative there. There's a way of people registering themselves in a way so you can look and find in a more structured way who is doing what. And so I'd certainly agree that some tapping in of the internet, which is something that Microsoft definitely could take the lead on, will create more understanding of who's doing what. And that is kind of ideal, because then the degree of coordination will emerge from that. You know, today when we give a grant, I ask, you know, how much is this funding people flying around to meet with each other, primarily in the rich world, actually, because there are just so many people have to get coordinated. Getting more of this online, getting less paperwork, having clear ways that you can look things up, that could lead to some additional efficiency.
Do you see that?
The great thing about coming to Davos is you learn something every day. I've just been at a meeting a few minutes ago when someone was explaining how they were mapping all the schools and all the resources available for education across Africa. So something is happening. Just one example of how we could coordinate things better to better effect, and not just simply for the sake of coordination. Rwanda, an agreement has been made today that private companies, a lot of them represented here at Davos, NGOs and governments will work together to improve the education opportunities available in Rwanda, and that this will be a joint project when the work will be shared between the different organizations, some of them American, some of them European, some of them from other parts of the world. And if in every country of Africa there is a determination to move ahead quickly on education, then in my view, it's not a technical or scientific or technological problem that's preventing us doing this. It's not even in the end a huge financial problem, because at the moment the cost of educating a child in Africa is only $100 a year, although it should be higher once we raise the quality of the education. So it's not essentially a financial problem. We could do it all for about 10 billion a year for every child who's not in education at the moment in the world. It's really a problem of organization and getting governments persuaded that this is a priority, making sure that capacity is delivered on the ground, getting all the different organizations who are prepared to play a part in that, and that includes private companies that are prepared to sponsor schools. So I agree with the questioner. You sometimes ask, well, if we are providing, as we are a British government, we are providing money for educating 15 million children over the next few years, 15 million children a year. And then you ask, well, there are 77 million children who are not being educated at the moment. Couldn't we all get together to make sure that this could happen on a systematic basis? And I do favour now private sector, NGOs, churches, faith groups, governments, looking on the ground with the governments of the countries, but sometimes simply with local people about what could be done. And I believe, just as in Rwanda we've got this initiative announced today, in the other countries we can make a huge impact. And I do say, of the Millennium Development Goals, education for every child, we've already got 30 million children into school in the last 6 or 7 years. 77 million children could be in education today but are not at school today. This is an achievable goal, and working together, I'm absolutely sure we can do it in the next few years.
Bob?
Yeah, I want to address this because it's actually a very critical issue to your, the overall title of this forum. The average African country has a few hundred different donors. They have thousands of projects, and the average size is about $1.5 million. So while I make the point that there is increased capacity in African countries, frankly, the fragmentation creates a real danger in terms of their ability to manage this effectively. And ultimately, as everybody's seen in developed countries, countries have to take responsibility of their own future. So it has to be connected back through the national government and their private sector and their civil society and others. So one of the challenges here is that in some ways the multiple funds are good. They help raise money for particular causes, HIV/AIDS and others. They help bring creative ideas, as the Gates Foundation is. But you have to figure out how to make this work in a more effective networked fashion. And one danger of the system, and here I want to compliment the British government, is there is still a role for multilateral institutions that work. It's what the World Bank does. We're in 100 different countries. We work with countries as they try to organize these donors. We're often not the biggest donor, but we do play a key role in trying to coordinate these efforts, whether it's Afghanistan or whether it's Timor-Leste. And we recently were very successful in raising $41.6 billion for the poorest 80 countries, and the UK became the biggest donor to this. That's not always easy to do because it's not easy to give money to multilateral funds. It's easier to do a bilateral program. But if you're really going to make development aid work, you're going to need to be able to have some integration of these different efforts, because otherwise they're just going to overwhelm some of these countries.
There's a question in the front there.
If I might just respond from the donor community, and then I'll pose a question. I'm Henrietta Four, and I'm the administrator of USAID and the director of United States Foreign Assistance. And we've begun talking about this very issue because there are so many of us working both bilaterally and multilaterally, as well as in the private sector in all of these countries. So we've begun talking about something called the Global Development Commons, and ways that we can share information, that we can trade and exchange ideas, and that we can go real time in the development world. So we're working with the World Bank and many others to try to get this into fruition, to make it country-based. If I may ask a question.
Please.
When we were gathered with several of the African ministers, one of their comments to us was that there's so much economic growth in Africa that part of the challenge, politically and economically, is to try to have a sense for the people on the street as to what it means to have GDP in the pocket. And their request of us was to do something above microenterprise, something that might be for entrepreneurs, to encourage entrepreneurship and let African students stay in Africa. Your thoughts?
Bob, you want to take that?
Certainly, although Trevor, I know, has worked on this. I'd actually start, Henrietta, with something below microenterprise. There have been a lot of well-run reform programs that have had good growth, good macroeconomic statistics, good investment prospects, but they're actually not filtering down for the poorest. And some of these programs that have been developed in Brazil, Mexico, India, called conditional cash transfer programs, where you target sums at those that are most needy, so you're not building in huge subsidies, but you might relate them to going to school. You might relate them to basic health care. End up being ways in which people at the bottom can start to see some opportunity and hope. Now, these programs also take some technical capacity. So as I was mentioning in the food assistance area, in some ways you want to start even smaller scale in terms of, say, school lunch programs or something. But then as you go up the scale, I think beyond microfinancing, we, through our private sector arm, IFC, are looking at some microequity possibilities. And I think that there are possibilities in the small business sector to try to create some of the seed capital to make these operations have a chance to work, create different jobs. It then fits back into the Prime Minister's notion about sort of sourcing networks. And I think that's another area that one of the lessons of development has been the macroeconomic numbers aren't enough. And by the way, everybody knows here you're going to have to sustain this politically. One of the reasons I'm worried about the high energy and food prices is for fragile democracies, that's a tough sell when you're doing that. So part of this is the challenge of political economy of development.
Michael, you wanted to say something?
And I think more this issue about coordination or collaboration. Of course, it's an issue that too many things happen at the same time. But I think what we try in Unilever to do is to make sure that we always work together with someone, whether it's a foundation or whether it's the UN programs or World Economic Forum, trying always to have, because we can only do certain things. But I think also we shouldn't be too afraid of this sub-optimization, because there's another dimension, and that is the enthusiasm of our own people out there in the field that try to drive, that figure out if we see our people in our tea plantation in Kenya or other people in Kenya that wants to do certain things, we have to help them when they have the initiatives. Those champions we should sort of not soften off. We should really try, because they are the drivers.
Sure. Trevor, you want to...
If I may, you know, one of the observations about everything discussed at Davos is that economics has made us all far more interdependent across the world. Politics keeps us divided, because politics tends to be either sovereign or sometimes very local. And part of resolving these issues is to bring politics in line with economics, so that we look for an improvement in the quality of life of people everywhere. Now, one of the difficulties that obtains in the donor communities is that we tend to look at things in a very specific way. So indeed, if a bridge collapses across the Mississippi River and it needs to be repaired, it is just an investment by the US government, whether it's state or federal. When a bridge is washed away on the Zambezi in floods there, then it's donor aid, it belongs somewhere else. It doesn't have the same notions of interconnectedness, which is why too many people in the world are left behind. So we're happy to receive taxes and profits from wherever goods are sold. But we don't take the same global view when it comes to investment in people and systems and infrastructure. And I think that's what we have to counteract. Now, there are very clear proposals in both the Paris Declaration and the OECD DAX Mutual Evaluation Framework, where you have a framework that clearly sets out what donors provide and what countries receive. And in the same way as you have the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, you will have absolute transparency about donor flows and where it actually goes to. Which means that in the same way as taxpayers in South Africa expect me to be honest and to account for every dime of taxes I've received from them, taxpayers everywhere should expect the same of governments everywhere. Now, we're not quite there yet, but I think it's worth striving for. And so what would happen in the course of that is that, and I'm tying this back to the first question you asked me, we strengthen governance so that this is not a myriad of donor agencies, each with their own 4x4 and kit and programs, falling all over each other in a fragmented way to get money onto the ground. It's taking a very different worldview of the interconnectedness of development. Might be a tad idealistic for now, but worth putting on the table, and I believe worth striving for. Thanks.
Believe it or not, we've come to the end of our session. And let me tell you, I started this session with feeling a sense of overwhelmed thoughts, because the problem was immense. We've been at it for 5 years, not much progress, but if there are more Bill Gates in the world who are going to fund initiatives, there's going to be more prime ministers like you, Prime Minister Brown, with the passion to push the MDGs. If we're going to have a World Bank head like you, Bob Zoellick, to hold bank accountable and move the initiatives along, and more finance ministers all over Africa like you, Trevor, and CEOs like you, Michael, to really make these things happen, I think we can crack this problem.
So do we get breakfast?
Oh, thank you. I have one suggestion, Klaus, if you'd allow us. Maybe next year we should have the same panel convene again. Get a different moderator, of course, but we should talk about what progress we made between this year and next. And perhaps then we can really see if we're making progress against this whole area of Millennium Development Goals and Africa in particular. And to all of you, the audience, thank you for coming to this panel, and to all of you on the panel, thank you for your participation. Thank you very much.